I believe every preacher, as he or she grows up, has the dream to stand in a pulpit on Easter Sunday and give convincing proof that Jesus of Nazareth was raised from the dead. As a kid, I used to imagine my first Easter Sunday in the pulpit, which, by the way, is today. I would tell the stories of all the lives I had seen changed by the risen Christ, families reconciled, those with addiction issues delivered, the disenfranchised restored. I wanted everyone leaving the service to know beyond the shadow of a doubt that Christ had been raised from the dead. Of course, as you grow and mature in faith, you realize that you can never give empirical evidence for the resurrection. There is none, and that's why we call it faith. But ever since my ordination, I knew the day would come when I would have to stand in the pulpit and preach on Easter Sunday. What does one say? The day preaches itself. There's not much else to add. But don't think for a minute I'm going to stop there. In February, I was at our diocesan council in Williamsburg. The keynote speaker was Diana Butler Bass. Many of you may know of her or her work. She's an independent scholar who writes about progressive Christianity. She was talking about the decline of the church in the West, addressing what many have called the death throes of mainline Christianity. And she posed this to the council. She said, "The question is not, do you believe in the resurrection? The question is, do you trust the resurrection?" That hit me like a ton of bricks. I was, to that point, so focused on belief in the resurrection that I wasn't even sure I had ever trusted it. So I started scanning my life, and I realized that there was a time when I trusted the resurrection because it was all I had left. In August of 2003, my grandfather was diagnosed with lung cancer. He was a very healthy 73-year-old man. He played golf 6 days a week, and he worked in his wood shop when it was too cold to play golf. And we thought, since he was so healthy and strong, that he had a good chance of beating the cancer. So the family rallied. We took him to chemo and radiation, and early on the results were very positive. But as the treatments progressed, I saw this tall, healthy golf buddy and grandfather grow feeble and weak and bent. And we started getting concerned that he wouldn't beat the cancer, but none of us wanted to admit that. In December of the same year, my mother and I took Granddaddy to the oncologist's office, and the doctor was very frank. He told us the cancer was terminal, and he doubted that we would make the next appointment in January. We were all devastated. The ride home was gut-wrenching. Papa, that's what we called him, didn't say a word the entire way home. And my mother and I knew he had to be in anguish, so we just sat there with him in the silence. Finally, I couldn't stand the silence any longer, so I bumped up the volume on the radio. As I started making out the words of the song on the radio, I realized it was Nicole Mullins singing "My Redeemer Lives." So I turned up the volume, and the three of us continued our journey home, bathed in the words from the book of Job. "I know my Redeemer lives. Let all creation testify. Let this life within me cry. I know my Redeemer lives." I'd love to tell you that all the pain of knowing that Papa wouldn't live was immediately replaced with hope. The pain was not replaced, but we did realize on our journey that there was life and there was hope beyond the pain. I think that is what trusting the resurrection is. It's knowing that there is abundant life when everything around you says that life is draining away. The resurrection is not quite so hard to believe in today on Easter Sunday, surrounded by beautiful music, gorgeous flowers, family and friends, and seated here in this magnificent Gothic church. But not too long from now, we'll leave this place. The festal shouts will be over. The flowers will fade. We'll return to ordinary life. And it's harder to trust in the resurrection in the mundane and the woof and warp of life. But that is where trusting in the resurrection matters most. I ran across this letter from a Siberian concentration camp. One Easter day, all of us who were in prison for religious convictions were united in the one joy of Christ. We were all taken into one feeling, into one spiritual triumph, glorifying the one eternal God. There was no solemn Paschal service with the ringing of church bells, no possibility in our camp to gather for worship, to dress up for the festival, or to prepare Easter dishes. On the contrary, there was even more work and more interference than usual. All of the prisoners here for religious convictions, whatever their denomination, were surrounded by more spying, by more threats from the secret police. Yet Easter was there, great, holy, spiritual, unforgettable. It was blessed by the presence of the risen God among us, blessed by the silent Siberian stars and by our sorrows. How our hearts beat joyfully in communion with the great resurrection. Death is conquered, fear is no more, and eternal Easter is given to us. Full of this marvelous Easter, we send you from our prison camp the victorious and joyful tidings, Christ is risen. I want you to leave here today continuing to trust that in the midst of your life struggles, Christ is risen. Not a Pollyanna glossing over of real grief, not a festal shout that ignores suffering and acts as if there isn't real sadness and evil in the world, but a whisper through the veil of tears, Christ is risen. Some years ago, Fred Craddock came to Virginia Wesleyan College here in Norfolk. He attended a workshop there and ran into a former student of his from Candler Theological in Atlanta. Her name was Karen Banning. Before seminary, Karen had worked as a cleaning woman at Carl Sandburg's home in Flat Rock, North Carolina, which is a national historical site. Karen said that Carl's family used to call him Charlie, and some of his poems were signed Charles Sandburg. She said one day she was cleaning out a cubbyhole in that old house, trying to straighten up, and she came across a piece of paper that had at the bottom, Charles Sandburg. She read it. She had never seen it before. She copied it and shared it with Fred. And this is what it said. So take up your cross and walk the thorn way. And if a sponge of vinegar be handed to you on a spear, take that too. The soul is woven of endurance. God knows. Charles Sandburg. I think Mr. Sandburg wrote that because he trusted in the resurrection. Trusting in the resurrection is synonymous with being a disciple of Christ. After the ascension of Jesus, the disciples regroup. They're encouraged. They're beginning to trust the resurrection, and they elect a disciple to take the place of Judas. When they describe the vocation of a disciple, they say that a disciple of Jesus Christ is a witness with us to his resurrection, one who trusts resurrection. And those disciples who on Good Friday deserted Jesus and denied knowing him, those same disciples went into the world emboldened by the resurrection. And as far as we know, each one of them gave his life in witness to the resurrection. Trusting in resurrection doesn't come at the end of some proof. Trusting in the resurrection comes as a response to the witness of the resurrection. And witnessing to resurrection takes courage, real courage. Building up your courage and your trust in the resurrection takes commitment, and it takes time. It took the disciples a long time to turn their astonishment at the empty tomb into the kind of courage and trust that it takes to give your life in witness to the resurrection. Take your time. The church, in its wisdom, has given us 50 days of Easter. And that's a good place to start asking yourself, do I trust in the resurrection? My hope and my prayer for each of us is that the next time we find ourselves in the grip of despair, the next time we find ourselves alongside Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane in anguish, the next time we find ourselves at the bedside of a loved one and we're losing hope, we'll hear the still small voice of the Spirit of God whispering through the veil of tears, Christ is risen. Amen.